Hi, and welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Maria O'Hanlon, a sci-comm enthusiast who uses her platforms, a bioblog, to share her passion for rare genetic diseases and effective science communication. Alongside this, she works as a research manager at the Lilly Foundation, a mitochondrial disease charity. She previously completed a BSc degree in biomedical science at Nottingham Trent University, then went on to complete an MRes degree at Newcastle University in Medical and Molecular Biosciences. She then completed a PhD at, how do you say that word, Teesside University, researching the role of mitochondria in Parkinson's disease using fruit flies as a model system. I should have read that before I
Don't
read
worry.
that. But so, how did you get into science communication?
It's a really good question. It was really when I started my PhD, and I just wanted to talk about what I was doing, and it's really as simple as that. I just wanted to share the excitement that I felt about the type of research that I was doing, especially working with fruit flies. I thought it was such an interesting model that I wanted to share with other people. And it kind of just spiraled from there, really. I saw that there was some people who were setting up science Instagram accounts, and I thought, oh, that seems like a good idea. So I set one up, not really kind of expecting anything from it, and it really spiraled. It sort of took off quite surprisingly, really. I didn't think that people would find the things that I had to say all that interesting. Um, and yeah, it just sort of went from there. I really found that that was a huge passion that I have. It was nice, really, because it allowed me an opportunity to really hone my skills in that area in a way where there was no pressure. It was all just off my own back. And I was able to just talk about what I wanted to talk about. And it just really showed me that for all I really enjoyed the research and sort of lab side of what I was doing, I actually really enjoyed more and probably found that I had more of a passion for, and dare I say, and this is hard for me to say because it feels a little bit like I'm patting myself on my own back, but a real skill for talking about science. And when I finished my PhD, it kind of just naturally happened. I was like, well, actually, I think this is what I would quite like to be my career. So I looked for science communication jobs and was lucky enough to kind of land one. And that kind of took off again from there, really. So yeah, it kind of all just started from the setting up of a little Instagram account.
I was a dedicated follower of your Instagram back in the day when you were going to lab and you would like be in the lab and you'd be like, oh, today is going to be a great day. I'm going to work on the lab. And then you'd post another story like, my experiment failed. And then you'd be like doing a sad face. But it was always like really lighthearted and entertaining, even though you were experiencing like scientific failures. How did you use science communication during your PhD, both as an outlet and as a um, I guess, support system?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, first of all, thank you. It's nice that you've been sort of following from the start and have been there for the whole journey. I think you're right. It was an outlet, and when I realized that there was other like-minded individuals out there who could sympathize with sort of the struggles that I was going through, where nobody else in my life really did. It's one thing kind of talking to another PhD student online and saying, I've had a really rubbish day because my experiment failed for the 75th time. And, I was living with my parents at the time. And although they're hugely supportive and have always been really supportive of what I do, it's not the same sort of going home and telling them what I've been doing. And they don't have backgrounds in science. They don't have a degree in like a similar area or anything. So I think it was difficult for them to really understand why sometimes I might be a bit glum or really struggling at the end of the day. And what I really found was that doing this sort of science communication where I was showing the bad side as well as the good really opened up the doors to have that kind of peer support from people who understood it. And I think as well, it really allowed me to sort of ground myself. It was a good way of kind of acknowledging that, today was supposed to be a good day. It ended up not being a good day, but that's okay. Tomorrow will be a brighter day. And I think, I really think that it's important to kind of seek that out when you are having those bad times. And making light of a situation also really helps. And you're maybe not going to do that when you're just on your own and you're kind of in the lab or in your own bedroom or wherever you are, kind of chastising yourself for a day going wrong, or lab experiments going wrong. You're not really going to kind of sit there and sort of take the mick out of yourself, really, and sort of have a bit of banter with yourself, whereas it's so much easier to do that when you're kind of talking to a community or talking to the camera. And that's what I really found. I could kind of be a little bit more upbeat about it than what I maybe would be if it was sort of just me moping on my own.
So did you find, so from your end, when you posted those, like, I don't know, like the whole day just failed, I'm gonna go home and eat popcorn or something. I don't know what you said, but like something like that, maybe that's pretty common on Science-stagram, I feel like, is like, oh, what a great day. I'm gonna do all these experiments. And then it's like, wah, wah, I can't do any of my experiments. So did people like message you being like, oh, that's okay? Do you recommend people do get an Instagram for moral support in their PhD?
Yeah, I think whether it's sort of setting up an Instagram, and I totally respect that it's not for everybody. So I'm not saying that it has to be a specific science Instagram account, but even just using your own social media, whether it's on Instagram, whether it's on Blue Sky, whatever kind of social media you're using. TikTok seems to be a really big one at the minute. That's kind of rising. Whatever kind of social media platforms you're across, I think you'll always find like-minded individuals. And yeah, I'd really encourage people to message people, whether it's sort of like a science communicator or a science Instagrammer, and sort of comment if they kind of relate to content. Or even sort of what used to really help me was I would get a lot of DMs from people who would comment and sympathize and really say, oh, tomorrow will be a better day, you've got this, or even just offer advice. It was really helpful for that as well. I remember some of the really dark days where I was trying to perfect qPCR and I'd never done qPCR before. It was going horrendously wrong. It took me probably about a year to kind of set up this particular experiment, and it just kept going terribly wrong. And it turned out that I was making a really stupid mistake. You basically had to we would put the flies into a little tube, and we'd homogenize them, so literally get a little stick and break them all up. And you had to put various different chemicals in, and at the end you had to get hold of the lysate. And it didn't twig in my head what the lysate was, and I thought that was the little bit of like water that was at the bottom. So I was getting rid of all the kind of good stuff and I was just chucking it out into the bin. And it was only literally through Instagram, somebody messaging me and saying, you're doing that experiment wrong, for me to actually realize that I was doing this massive mistake. And that was the reason why my DNA and my RNA levels were absolutely shocking. And if I hadn't have done that, goodness knows how long I would have been doing it wrong for. So I think it's a really good platform and a really good opportunity to kind of share the things that you're doing to peers, because it's one thing kind of talking to people who are in the same situation as you, and it's a whole different ball game talking to maybe your like professor or your supervisor who you might be a little bit scared of. I'm not saying that I was scared of my supervisor, but you never want to kind of go up to them and say that you've screwed up. So it was really good for that. So definitely I would say, if you're in that position and doing a PhD, utilize all of the resources that are around you. Science Instagram is a huge resource for that.
I didn't know you could actually get help on your protocols from people on Instagram. That's probably reassuring to people watching this that are in a PhD program that are needing help with their protocols. The cool thing about Science Instagram is you can meet people with like similar research interests and like follow them, and then they're also your other people in the field. So I guess it's like if they publish a paper and they post about it on Instagram and you read it, or like you watch the Instagram video of them explaining what it is. It's kind of like keeping up with other researchers in your field. Did you do that? Like, what ways did you use Instagram for scholarly purposes besides the ways you just talked about?
Yeah, I know, 1,000%. You're so right. And I think it sounds really weird, but I think it's actually a really good opportunity to network and find people that are in your disease area or your kind of study area, and really networking with them. It's a lot more informal than LinkedIn. And I think you can get to know people on a bit more of a personable level. It's a really good way, actually, to find mentors, people who've kind of gone through it before you, whether they're even just like a year or two ahead, being able to speak to people who've gone through that experience and actually, you know, learn from their mistakes or learn from their experiences, and they can share their experiences with you is absolutely incredible. I've met so many people through Instagram who I don't think I ever would have met if I'd just kind of networked in the standard way at conferences or through LinkedIn. I think it's been absolutely essential for that, for me anyway.
And now you do science communication. So tell us about how you use science communication in your current role.
Yeah, so I'm a research manager. So my kind of biggest job is to look after the research portfolio. But alongside that, I really work hard to disseminate information about mitochondrial disease research. Part of that is still kind of keeping up with the field. So reading papers, speaking with people who are kind of releasing cutting edge techniques or maybe cutting edge therapies, and actually talking to patients and the public about that. And why I think that's so important. And this was set home for me when I started going to the residential weekends that the Lilly Foundation run. And they run 3 residential weekends a year. One is aimed at families. Typically, those are parents who have an affected child with mitochondrial disease. Or there's another residential weekend that's aimed at adults with mitochondrial disease. So those are obviously people with mitochondrial disease themselves. And then there's also a young adult weekend. And it was in the first year that I'd been working there, and I went to the family weekend for the first time. And there was quite a few people who came up to me after I gave a little bit of a research lecture. And I think, you know, my kind of lecturing style anyway is quite informal. I like to kind of break things down. I like to kind of make quips. It's not that dissimilar to kind of my Instagram content. And I try and kind of, you know, make it as personable as possible. And there was quite a few people came up to me afterwards and said, you know what, I've never, ever been able to explain this condition to my family before. And now I feel like I can, or I've never been able to articulate what it means that this particular gene is mutated in my son or my daughter. And now I feel like I can. And that really hit home for me. I mean, I cried the whole way home because it really sort of hit me. That these are people who have this condition and yet they don't know how to talk about it, or it's either not being explained to them, or they're kind of seeing things online and they can't explain that to their kind of family members. And it kind of hit home a little bit more in that I was getting a lot of requests through at that point from patients who were asking about papers that had been published. And they said, you know, I've seen this paper that's been published in this particular gene that I'm affected by. It's talking about a therapy, but I don't understand what this paper is saying. And for me, I was like, well, of course, like, you know, these papers are written by scientists for scientists. A patient who's got no science background is going to look at this and think, what on earth is going on? So from there, this kind of separate part of my role has been born, which is really kind of breaking down these complex topics into kind of bite-sized chunks that I can then kind of go to patients with and say, okay, well, you might hear something about, I did a video the other day where I was talking about genomic testing, and that's something that is talked about a lot in patient clinics, but a lot of patients are sort of like, we actually don't know what that means. And I was like, okay, well, if I was going to sit down and explain this to my family, for example, I'd use an analogy. So I was like, okay, well, DNA testing is like baking a cake. And I kind of talked through the different stages of baking a cake. And I was like, there might be a problem with the recipe. And that's kind of where you would look at like the DNA. It might be a problem with the recipe book or the chef. And that's maybe where like RNA sequencing would come in. Or it might be that there's no problems with any of that, but there's a problem with your oven. And that's sort of where we look at proteomics. And I was just sort of breaking it down step by step using a really kind of simple analogy that people would be able to follow, which was baking a cake. And it had such good responses. And that's sort of how I use that science communication now. It's not just kind of in the writing of scientific information in an accessible way to patients and families and the public, but it's also in kind of creating video content and ways that we can kind of explain these really complex topics in a way that's accessible to patients. And one of the things that I'm kind of most proud about of my job is setting up something called the Research Zone, which is on the Lilly Foundation website. And it's a place where I basically write blogs or sort of record videos, post videos that is explaining these kind of topics to patients and families. And the kind of response from that has been really quite positive, and it's been so lovely to catch up with these patients who I saw, a year ago, who are now kind of seeing these videos, seeing these pieces of written content, and are saying, oh, I actually really understand that now. It's just so lovely to be able to do something that I enjoy so much, but in a way that's really benefiting people. So it's, without a doubt, to be honest, it's probably my favorite part of the job. I mean, obviously I love science communication through the sort of Instagram stuff that I've done, but being able to actually put that into practice has been just amazing.
I love that. And I love that you're using science communication to help patients directly, because a lot of the people that have these rare diseases are not scientists. And I barely know what the mitochondria does. And I have two science degrees. So for them to not know what their dysfunction is a little bit heartbreaking. And it's weird though, because I've noticed even here in the US, when people have a disease like that, the communication about it is more about like helping them and empathy than actually informing them. And I feel like what they want most is answers. So, how have you been able to use science communication to do that? Or have you been able, do you work with patients directly?
Yeah, so I guess a really good example of that is at the minute, one of the kind of hot topics is how long it takes to get mitochondrial disease treatments from kind of bench to bedside. So we're talking about, getting these treatments into clinical trials. And it's definitely not exclusive to the mitochondrial disease community. It's a problem that's kind of being seen across rare disease in general, but it's really hard to explain to patients. I think especially families where they've got a really, acutely ill child who potentially is not going to be with us for much longer because they're so unwell, and being able to explain to them that yes, there are some therapies and treatments that are kind of potentially on the horizon, but getting them through clinical trials takes such a long time. That's quite a hard concept to get across. And actually what we've been doing is spending a lot of time talking to patients about the kind of journey to getting treatments approved, and kind of talking through what happens in a clinical trial and why it takes so long, and actually taking that time to explain what we probably think is quite a simple concept, because as you say, like if you have a sort of science degree, you're just kind of aware of this sort of thing happening, but patients aren't. And being able to explain that, I think, is really quite helpful to them. And I mean, of course it doesn't take away the pain and the stress that they're going through, but it hopefully helps them to understand that we are trying. There's a lot of things happening and we are trying to kind of speed up these processes, but ultimately it is still a long process. So that's kind of one way. And then I think another is just, again, sort of, and I mentioned it before, telling them about things like trials that are ongoing at the moment. So something that I sometimes do is, if there's any clinical trials that are ongoing at the moment in the space, I will kind of work with the coordinators of those trials to get some kind of patient-centric and understandable information across that we can kind of put on our website or put onto social media that explains what these trials are and how people can get involved in them, and whether that's patients or family members of patients. And so I think that's a really important thing to do as well, because it's really important that people understand what it is that they're signing up for or what these requests are for. And, ultimately, science communication is such an integral part of all of those things. And you might not think it from the outside looking in, but actually behind the scenes, there is a lot of work that goes into making all of this information as kind of understandable for a patient as possible.
Do you guys have commercials about pharmaceuticals on your television and radio?
No, not at all. There's really strict rules around that sort of thing. And even when it comes to things like clinical trials, we can't be seen to like advertise them. And I say that in kind of like quotation marks. We can talk about them and we can say what the benefits of them are, but we have to be really balanced about how we approach these things. We can't be seen as too promotional. And it's for that particular reason, because there's just a lot of kind of ethical rules that surround, drug use, like drug advertising. It's a real kind of minefield, to be honest.
So then you don't have the problem in the UK or even elsewhere in Europe. There's a commercial that I saw. It was like people vacationing like on a boat or something, and then there's like a dog running around. It's like, talk to your doctor about like such and such drug. And then it doesn't say what it does. It doesn't tell me what the drug does. It doesn't say anything about it other than the drug's name. And I find that really unethical to just like promote these drugs and have the pharmaceutical companies pay all this money to get the drug names out there without knowing what the drugs are, what they do, how they can help people, who they can even help.
I find it insane to even kind of hear about that, because it's just something that you don't see over here. And I don't know if it's potentially the way that the pharmaceutical kind of business works over here, in that, we don't really have that many options about what drugs are prescribed to us. So I went to the doctors the other day because I had a wisdom tooth infection. I got prescribed an antibiotic and a painkiller, but the doctors don't sit there and say, what type would you like? What do you fancy today? It's nothing like that. I think we get less choice because it's kind of all in like the doctor's hands. Whereas, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think you kind of, as you say, like you can kind of request certain medications and it kind of just works in such a different way. But yeah, I mean, I used to work in pharma marketing. So for a year before I started this current job, just after I finished my PhD, I worked in, it was B2B marketing. So it's a little bit different than B2C, which would obviously be a bit more like customer facing. But even then we had to be really careful if we were kind of talking about a particular drug or a particular technique to produce a drug. We still had to be careful not to be kind of too promotional. So yeah, I find it crazy that that's sort of something that is just casually on your TV screens while you're having your tea. It's wild.
Yeah, that is something that we have. It's kind of concerning. In general, since you've worked in marketing, I wonder if you have also noticed this thing that when pharmaceutical companies communicate, they don't do so in an evidence-based way. They do more in an emotional way. And I wonder, like, there's some benefits to that, because obviously if you communicate more about like in a way that's more conversational rather than like scientific and analytical, people are more likely to listen to you. But I wonder, like, in your work as a scientist working in marketing, have you applied any, without giving away your secret sauce, any unconventional ways to improve the current state of science marketing?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think it's hard to answer that from the perspective of my kind of previous role. So where I was working in like pharmaceutical marketing, it was talking about systems and technology. So it is very evidence driven of, X machine works really well. It has a throughput rate, 75% higher than the market average. That was all kind of very evidence based. I don't know if it is just because I'm in the rare disease space and everything is very patient focused, but it is quite emotion driven. And kind of from the outside looking into the marketing department at the charity, when they're looking at like campaigns, it's all based on how people feel, and it's always talking about the why, like why are we doing this. It's always focusing on the fact that there's lives at stake, or there's a family somewhere that's affected in X way, talking about maybe specific symptoms. So I think a lot of the stuff that we do is very kind of emotional, with, I suppose, the exception of there is obviously data backing it, because there is obviously like clinical and patient data that supports that this is the way that people are feeling. But, from a kind of marketing perspective, I would say that everything is pretty emotive. I branched sort of two parts. I was part of the content team and I branched two separate parts of that. So there was the scientific writing, which was maybe more on the case of white papers. So that was obviously very sort of scientific. That was written to fellow scientists. It was very, very data driven. It was not too dissimilar from kind of, writing papers. I did a lot of creative content as well. So I kind of bridged the gap in between the scientific team and the creative team, where sometimes that was looking at maybe writing slogans for pharmaceutical companies. I can't really think of like an example off the top of my head, but like one sentences that could be kind of used on a billboard, that kind of thing, or phrases that were being used for marketing brochures, things like that. and social media as well was a big part of that. So I would write a lot of social media for LinkedIn, whether that was from the company themselves or whether that was maybe working with like the CEO to kind of curate content for them to put out onto their own kind of social media platforms.
So have you come up with any good slogans um, as a science marketer?
Oh, I, I have, but I can't talk about any of them. The problem is
Oh
that
yeah.
you
Are
sign
you
these
under
kind of like,
NDA?
yeah, like you sign these like CDAs and you can't kind of say it. So I can't even say the companies that I worked for. I can kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, say that they're like big pharma companies that you'll definitely have heard of, maybe relating to COVID. But I can't kind of say who the companies were. Quite a few that we were working with at the time, but it's really annoying because there was some stuff that I was so proud of and I would love to be like, oh, I came up with that. But in reality, I just can't share it. But yeah, I have seen some stuff out there, like some slogans for pharmaceutical companies where I've written the tagline. So yeah, that was pretty cool. But yeah, I couldn't tell anybody about it, which was a bit of a bummer because, wanted that pat on the back that was a really good tagline. But it's actually a lot harder than I thought it would be. You think that you would kind of sit down and you'd come up with this like really cool one liner and that would just be it. But in reality, we would sit for, me and sort of my boss, we would sit for a couple of hours just kind of batting different versions back to each other where we were maybe moving the wording around or we were sort of having a bit of a play on words. And this would be like a 5-word phrase. And we would spend like 3 hours just like looking at it and moving the words around, changing the words slightly. Sometimes it was really soul destroying work because it was so sort of specific, and sometimes things would land, sometimes they wouldn't, and it was quite a difficult job actually. So I have nothing but respect for the people who kind of do that now. But yeah, it was quite cool.
That's cool because I also did that kind of work in COVID and it was the same, just like brainstorming sessions. I wanted that credit because I could put it on my portfolio and say, hey, look, I've worked with this company. You have definitely heard of this company. Look at this thing that I created for them that I can't tell you I created. It would be nice if I got the credit for the work I did under NDA, but I can't because I signed an NDA. At least it's out there helping humanity, and it's kind of fun to do those brainstorming sessions. But when you're working for like those really big companies, you can't just come up with something. It has to be something
Mm.
good, and it has to be something that you think it will resonate with them. So it's like really, really more creative in many respects than it is a scientific process.
Hugely. I think it really helped that I kind of had that scientific background because I think I kind of came at things from a slightly different angle than what the sort of pure creative team would be able to do. So I think it was nice to kind of add that different perspective. It was only really towards the end of my time there that I became a bit more what we would call kind of client facing. And I remember just being terrified sitting in these meetings with these, big marketing executives from these like big pharmaceutical companies, and I was just this like little fresh out of my PhD girly who was like, I hope you like my tagline. But it was, what, I think the skills that I got from that job was so helpful in that I've been able to bring a lot of that to kind of like my current job, in that sometimes I kind of feel a little bit, and I don't know if this will sound big-headed, I hope that it doesn't, but like a kind of multi-trick pony, in that I kind of started my job as a research manager, which was obviously just supposed to be looking at the research portfolio. But I think the reason why my job has evolved in the way that it has into doing more science communication and like a little bit of marketing alongside that is because of that job and kind of the skills that I got from that. And if I hadn't have been, writing taglines, writing social media posts for all of these companies, I don't know if I'd be able to do my current job as well. So it was definitely really helpful, and I'm glad that I did it. And sometimes, I do kind of look back and think, that it was a really useful time, and I'm really grateful for it.
I've never sat in a room with marketing executives. I think the scariest thing about that would be coming up with an idea that I absolutely loved and being like, this is the best idea. Like, you guys, you don't get it. This is edgy. This is what we, because that's how it is in marketing. Have you ever seen Mad Men? I haven't watched it actually. It's about working in advertising and marketing. It's got John Hamm.
I've seen bits of it. I haven't seen the full thing, but I've seen like clips online, so I kind of know enough. Yeah.
going into a room of people and then like being like, here's my great idea, like I've researched this is a great idea, and just having them completely shoot down your idea is my nightmare for.
Oh no, totally. I totally understand that, and I would be and am exactly the same, to be honest. I think you really have to detach your kind of ego when you kind of go into these things, and you learn quite quickly that you can't attach your self-worth to these projects, because you're right, they'll just get ripped apart. And sometimes people are hard to please. It's not necessarily that you haven't done a good job. It might just be that your idea doesn't quite align with what these sort of executives are wanting. And I think a good marketing agency will be able to make sure that you kind of do get there and that things are as closely aligned as possible. But ultimately these are still people, they've got their own ideas. And it was really hard going from a PhD where all of your self-worth is very sort of results based, and if you're not kind of getting those good results, sometimes I think it can feel like you're not doing a good job and your self-worth kind of plummets a little bit. It was really hard to change my mindset from that to when I was then doing the marketing job, because if I'd continued with that sort of headspace and with that mindset, I think I would have like ended up going sort of on the sick with stress, because you do kind of get things tore apart so often, and what you think is so great, as you say, it's so edgy, it's so cool, but if they don't see it that way, it is quite hard. And yeah, I did find it quite hard sometimes, having this sort of idea that I poured my heart into for weeks, to then sort of have it poo-hooed and then say, actually, we really hate this, was really quite hard. So like changing my kind of my headspace and my mindset to being like, you know what, my self-worth doesn't depend on this. It's a job, and that's all it is at the end of the day. So that was quite a hard thing, I think, to do, because as I say, as a PhD student, I think you do kind of get very hung up on those results, and that is purely your kind of self-worth. The amount of papers that you've got out, how big your lab group is, it's all kind of based on that, whereas it is quite different, I think, in the outside world.
Working with these like large companies you can't tell anyone you worked with, I want to do something better than the status quo. Like the status quo science marketing is just devoid of facts. It doesn't tell you anything. And I hope this doesn't offend anyone that works in science marketing for some of these big companies, but it's like they have to make an ad, so they make an ad, but they don't bring anything new to the table. So like I tried to bring something new to the table, and a lot of times I was able to do so. Were you trying to innovate, and were you able to bring anything new to the table without giving away anything that would compromise your NDA?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really good point. And I think sometimes some marketing can come across as a bit soulless, and it is sometimes sort of sheep following sheep, really, and sort of going with the trends. Whereas, yeah, I mean, my favorite people to work with, my favorite companies to work with, were always the ones who were really willing to push the boat out and kind of stick their neck out a little bit and try some different things. At the time, there weren't many pharma groups, many biotech groups who were doing Instagram. And obviously, as we know, I'm kind of very passionate about Instagram. And I was like, you need to get on Instagram. Like, we can do so much more if you get on Instagram. And I was talking about how we can repurpose content. And, I was talking about how we could have carousel posts, and we could use that on Instagram but also on LinkedIn. So we weren't putting in any extra effort, we were just going to kind of repurpose content as much as we could. But I thought it was really worthwhile to kind of build up their presence a little bit, and I sort of put together this proposal and mocked up some graphics for what their kind of Instagram could look like. And I went to them in this meeting, and I kind of like, my knees were knocking together, I was really scared. I was like, I think it would be a really good idea if you maybe consider doing Instagram. And actually being able to kind of talk about that and try and persuade them that was a good way to go felt so good. And like, to date, it's probably one of like my proudest moments. And I mean, of course, you would get sort of some people, and they'd say, I want a really out of the box idea. And sometimes they would go with like a slightly wacky idea that was breaking the mold. Sometimes you'd sort of propose that and they'd say, whoa, that's a little bit too crazy, let's dial it back a bit. And you'd sort of go back to maybe something that's a little bit more familiar to them. And I do understand that, these are multi-billion companies most of the time, and they don't want to kind of risk their reputation. But I think from a marketing perspective, and for sort of that satisfaction of the job, it was always really nice to get something a little bit different and be able to kind of implement that. And it was always a really proud moment when they did kind of say, yeah, we'll go with that. And then being able to kind of look at the analytics a month or so on and see that it's worked. Oh, the relief, the kind of pride in yourself that would give you was just like second to none. It was a really great feeling.
It is a great feeling to like have, except for the fact that you can't say you wrote it, but like if you write
Yeah.
something and then everyone's like, "Oh, this is so amazing." Like, "Wow, where has this been for all my life?" And then you're like, "I can't tell you that I wrote this, but I wrote this and I'm happy that you enjoyed this content." What do you think you bring to the table? And a lot of times it's like these creative teams, you can be a science creative, but they're not science creatives. They're just like creative creatives. Well, science creatives are creative creatives, but they don't have a science background. It's like there's a scientist that's working with the creatives. So, what do you think your science background brought to the table of creatives?
That is a really good question. I think it was just that different perspective, kind of being able to understand the technical side of things made it a little bit easier sometimes to be able to come up with creative ideas that still aligned with the sort of scientific concepts. And that was, I think, something that I was quite happy to bring to the team. And, I like to hope something that was kind of a little bit unique to me. I'm not saying that I'm the only person in the world who can do it, but that is something that I like to think that I do kind of bring to teams is those kind of different mindsets of I've always kind of got two hats on. I've got that creative hat on, but I've also got that scientific hat on. And I think that allowed me to kind of come up with ideas that really mesh the two together. So I think that was really quite helpful. And, especially working as part of teams and, the people that I worked with were just like hugely talented, so impressive. We all came together and were able to get like really good ideas on the table, because I think the best teams are the ones that are made up of varied individuals, the ones who have different backgrounds. And, not just me, but sort of with people that had those other kind of backgrounds. When we sat around the table and tried to come up with these concepts, it just worked really well. So I think, having that kind of that scientific background really helped to come up with like new ideas, and that was still, aligned with the science, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. I have no way of knowing who is on these creative teams for these large pharma companies, but based on my experience and based on your experience, I feel like I can say that it would be nice if they hired more scientist type creatives to consult with the other creatives and provide kind of like a science input, especially here in the US. We have a lot of misinformation, sometimes coming directly from our government. I don't think you guys have that problem, but we need scientists. Like now industry is kind of taking, and nonprofits and education are taking the role of government in here in the US. So yeah, so there's always a role for scientists in marketing, um, to make it better and to be that, what's it called, the je ne sais quoi, the thing, the like secret sauce of the marketing companies. I think that could be a good secret sauce.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I think that's why I always say that, a STEM degree in general is a really good degree to have, because I think it makes you as an individual a little bit of a chameleon. You have so many skills that you can bring to different jobs. And I think it really lends itself to working in marketing, because, you have that technical knowledge, you really understand the science, but also you know how to solve problems, you know how to kind of look at things maybe from a different angle, and you are quite creative. You have to be creative to come up with like scientific concepts sometimes and really think outside of the box. Things like resilience, organizational skills, you really do sort of come out of a STEM degree with such a kind of well-rounded set of skills. So I think, definitely, I really agree that, in these kind of big corporations, or, I think scientists have a place in kind of politics, education, policy making, decision making, kind of across the board. I think they can always really bring something that's quite unique.
So what lessons have you learned from science communication that have actually improved your scientific work?
I think starting with the messaging is always really important. I think at the start of my kind of scientific journey, I would just talk about things for the sake of talking about them, and I'd maybe explain a concept and I just assume that kind of hit home with, like, landed really well, and then I'd just move on. Whereas now I think I've learned a lot more about kind of going back to these things and really kind of taking the time to sort of understand the kind of audience. And it's not just about me kind of talking, it's about making sure that I understand what the needs of the audience are and kind of what they maybe need. And I think that's sort of really important, to be honest, and potentially something that I wouldn't have learned if I kind of hadn't been doing sort of like Instagram and sort of really honing in on those sort of skills. It's really hard. I think there's just like, I've learned so much in terms of science communication, and it's really hard to kind of articulate one thing that's really been kind of the standout, because there's been so kind of so much within it. I think talking about science effectively is a real skill, and I think I've learned, probably by a lot of mistakes over the years, what's maybe better. And I think that's probably what I've been trying to say, but I've been waffling on a little bit, is there's sort of a lot of take-home points that I've learned over the years that I now try to kind of apply to my science communication moving forward. One of it is like talking about why things matter. So not just talking about what I do, but actually why what I do matters. Talking about the purpose first. So like why something matters, what the problem is, how this work or what I'm talking about kind of fits into that. And as well, I think assuming that people know more than they do, it's, I think, really easy, and this is something that I think a lot of scientists fall into the trap of, assuming that the audience knows more. And I think it's really easy when you're in science and you sort of advance in your career to forget what people don't know, because this becomes your everyday and you sort of know everything so well inside and out. And it's when you're kind of explaining a topic, you jump quite a few steps ahead rather than actually starting with the stuff that people need to follow along. And it's funny because I've actually been working on a bit of an Instagram series where I've been talking about this and kind of these mistakes that I think scientists are making and why they kind of need to think about this. And I think I've seen this in a lot of professionals that I've come across over the years, where they just don't know how to communicate effectively because they've been in their kind of scientific bubble for so long that they've almost forgotten what it's like to communicate with people who don't understand that. And when you're working in part of these big research groups or working with these big companies, you forget that there's people outside of that who won't understand things like the jargon and why you really need to give simple explanations. Something that we talk about a lot is talking about DNA or like proteins. If I went up to somebody on the street and said, what do you know about proteins? They'll probably start talking about chicken or like the gym and gains, where actually, we're obviously not talking about that. And I think, it's really easy to forget that people don't understand what we think is sort of plain language. So that's something that I think is really important. And then again, I think coming back to what you were talking about before, about emotion, and I think science communication a lot of the time is about emotion, and emotion really drives attention. Talking about like the relevance of something, whether that's to the human impact, that X kills so many people a year, or this particular treatment is going to save so many lives, whatever it is, that emotional entry point I think is really important, and that's what keeps people invested. I can talk until the cows come home about the type of science that interests me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to interest other people, whereas emotion normally does. So kind of starting with that emotional aspect is really important. And I think finally, just checking for understanding, whether it's, you're in a classroom, whether you're sort of in a meeting, a board meeting, a lab meeting, whatever it is, just having a conversation one-on-one with somebody is actually like checking, do they understand something, rather than just bleating on about a concept and just assuming that they are following. Actually stopping, taking stock and saying, does this make sense? And just listening to the feedback. People are intelligent. They can tell you if they understand something, if they think that something's interesting. And it's a little bit like what we were saying before about having that feedback can sometimes feel a little bit like a dagger to the heart, but it's really important, I think, to listen to people. And I mean, obviously, if there's people trolling you and stuff like that, take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. But listen to what people are saying. Don't just assume that because you're the expert in a particular topic that you know it all, because the likelihood is that you don't. We're all learning. And I think science communication is a bit of a journey. It's something that's ever evolving. It's something that's hard to keep up with because it does sort of move about a lot, whether it's from Instagram to a different social media platform, whether it's the style of communication that we do. Back when I started, a lot of it was photo content. Now it's a lot more video content, which can be quite hard to kind of come up with off the cuff, maybe, if it's not just sort of like a silly dance to a song. And that evolves, I think, anyway. As you get a bit older, your kind of content evolves and you find a little bit more what your niche is.
I recently came up with this slogan. It's not a real slogan. I mean, it's like not like you like working and like coming up with catchphrases. Like, that sounds really cool. My idea was that if your audience doesn't understand your message, your job isn't done. Part of your job involves getting them to understand your message. And like, that's kind of a tall order for science communicators. And I'm not saying that to say like, oh, you're such a bad person, this person didn't get their COVID vaccine, like, look at you, tisk tisk. But to say like, if you're confused and angry as to why people didn't get your message, it's time to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new message. And it's kind of like a tough love thing. But here in the US, where you don't live in the US, so you don't know, every day the government has a new thing that makes scientists angry. And there's all this stuff happening. And it's like, all the science communicators are really angry about that, and justifiably so. But it's like part of, I don't know whose job this would be, but as a science communicator, maybe all of our jobs is to communicate effectively. And if people don't understand your message, then that's on you. That's not on the person you're talking to. And reframing science communication like that, for me, it makes the job seem more like an uphill battle, like pushing a rock up a hill kind of. But it's more, I feel like it's more effective that way, to see like, are people really getting the message? And that basically, in a way, insulted like pretty much every science communicator out there living in the US, which I didn't mean to say it that way, but kind of like, what are your thoughts on my new slogan that I just came up with yesterday?
I like it. I think you are right in that. You know, sometimes you are the problem. And I think you're right. It is really hard sometimes to sort of, and I don't mean you as in like you, but like you, like as a person, like me, myself, and I. It's sometimes you do need to kind of step outside a little bit and look from the outside in and really kind of reevaluate where you are. And I think that is really important and something that is quite hard. I think it's really hard to not kind of put too much pressure on yourself, because realistically, we're not going to move mountains. We're not going to, especially kind of doing science communication online. We can do as much as we can. And I remember sort of during the COVID pandemic, I did a couple of blog posts where I was getting so frustrated hearing people talk about how COVID had came about and how these new variants were being created, and the spread of misinformation was just insane, and I was getting so frustrated. So I ended up doing a few blog posts to kind of try and talk about it from a real, just science driven point of view. And there was two people who I'd sort of vaguely know them, who were pretty kind of on the extreme side of the scale when they were thinking about COVID and were sort of spreading misinformation. And they reached out to me and said, what you wrote made sense. And now I understand that. And I realized that what I was saying was wrong. And I think even knowing that you've helped one or two people means that you've done a good job. So I think, especially with the sort of the current state of play in America, and I don't want to comment on it too much because obviously I'm not American. I don't live there. I don't know what it's like, but I can only sympathize with you all at the minute, because I imagine it must be really difficult. But if you're doing science communication, and even if kind of what you're putting out there helps one or two people, then you're doing a good job. And I think sort of setting your expectations there and not trying to kind of move mountains by, completely rewriting the narrative, because oftentimes you can't. It's really hard to come up against these big sort of powerful people who are spreading misinformation. I think it's really important to just sort of do your little bit. And as I say, even if you're kind of helping one or two people, then that's kind of all you can ask for. So I would just kind of encourage as many people as possible to kind of, speak the gospel truth and really sort of share the actual scientific basis for kind of anything. And this goes for any kind of misinformation that's being put out there. If you do know something is wrong, then try and communicate that as best as you can. I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
I mean, it's good to keep in mind because it's like we could get mad at ourselves. I was flipping through Instagram and everyone was just angry. And my first instinct was, this is on us. But it's like, well, you don't tell someone that's incredibly sad and disappointed that it's your fault. I mean, but it's like the job of the science communicator is the communication piece. And if someone doesn't understand it, that is more work for the science communicator, which is kind of like unfortunate. But there's this idea of like having trusted messengers in each community that can communicate science in a way that their community needs it to be communicated. So that's a challenge that we had in COVID and that is still not over for us. Definitely here in the US, probably elsewhere in the world. It's been really great chatting with you today. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for having me on. It's been quite a while since I've done an interview like this, so it's really been really nice to kind of actually reflect, because I think I don't spend enough time just stopping and kind of reflecting. I think it's really nice to have been able to stop and reflect how far I've come, because it has been a wild journey, and I've done a lot of things that I am really proud of, and there's these sorts of opportunities wouldn't have come about if I sort of hadn't have put myself out there. And I've met some incredible people along the way as well. I mean, I've got some friends that I've kind of met through the science communication world who, I mean, I've sort of been to their weddings, they came to my wedding. They're like some people who I would class as like my absolute bestest friends, and I wouldn't have met them if it hadn't have been for the sort of science communication world. Science communication has brought me a lot, and I'm just really sort of grateful that I can still work in this space and sort of have these conversations with people like you. So yeah, it's been really nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you. It's been really, really lovely speaking with you too.